Hi, I'm Suze Moore and welcome back to the wonderful adventures of Nat Walker in Crimson Poison. Today with Nat already in Mongolia, learning how to ride on horseback for the first time through the ice-cold steppe in the snow. I thought it'd be fun to invite Star to join us for the reading. We'll see how we go on. So, we're going to start with chapter 46, Almost Encounter. Now here we are in the magnificent turn of the century sitting room. It commands a glorious central position in the house and of course boasts breathtaking views over the harbour, said Mr. Wing, directing them over to the floor-to-ceiling windows. Henry traipsed after Prissy and Aunt Vera as they squealed in delight. Their sharp heels dug into the priceless rug as they rushed over to take in the view. They'd been looking at houses since 8 o'clock in the morning, and it was now late afternoon. Henry was bored and exhausted. Mr. Wing, estate agent to the rich and famous, wore a grey silk suit and a white shirt with a purple tie. And everything about him reminded Henry of sharks circling, hunting their prey in those nature films on Channel 56. "This is like So It!" shrieked Prissy, her glitter cat robot clipped onto her shoulder, filming everything. "Just wait till I show Candy. She's going to be so jealous." Aunt Vera clapped her hands together. "We'll take it, Mr. Wing. It feels like home already." Mr. Wing smiled, flashing his pearly white, perfect teeth, and looked at his gold watch. "I think a celebration is in order. I suggest we move to the peninsula, where we can discuss details over some champagne. My treat, of course, ladies." Henry sighed. The day had just got a lot longer. The hotel manager greeted Mr. Wing like an old friend and escorted them to a central table in the bar. Aunt Vera's eyes lit up when she saw a bottle of vintage Dom Perignon in a silver ice bucket awaiting them. "Mr. Wing, you rotten spoiler," she said, giggling girlishly. Henry slumped down in a blue velvet armchair. One sip of champagne and he knew his mother would want to stay there for hours. The waiter carefully popped the cork and poured their glasses. "Henry, darling, a Shirley Temple for being such a good boy." Henry's cheeks burned at the humiliation of being offered such a girly drink, and he took a quick look around the bar in case any of his friends might be there. "A popco juice, please," he said. "Sir, I see you have your robot with you. Might you enjoy this?" said the waiter, leaning across to press the underarm of Henry's chair. The velvet cover slid back to reveal a flat, disc-shaped screen. Henry placed Nut on top. The robot's eyes lit up bright blue. His tail flattened against his back, and his screen appeared. "Wow, it's the latest Scowler Stone movie," said Henry, reading the movie listings. "All the latest releases. Welcome to the peninsula," said the waiter. Maybe being at the peninsula wasn't so bad after all. Henry lounged back in the chair. "Henry, take my photo," snapped Prissy, thrusting her glitter cat at him. "I'm busy," he said. Prissy pouted. He sighed and pointed the cat's eyes at her. "Not so close," she said. He leaned back and Prissy held up her glass, tossed back her hair and smiled for the camera. He took a load of shots and handed the glitter cat back to her. She immediately checked them out. Take a couple more. Make sure you get some background to show my friends so they know where I am." Henry lifted the cat again. Suddenly, to his horror, through the holographic viewfinder, he spotted Dr. Tang sitting only a few seats away. She was with two friends, sipping tea from a china cup. Henry reached under the glitter cat's neck and switched it to manual. He scrolled through the pictures and used the blur function to mask out Dr. Tang's face. Thank goodness Prissy hadn't noticed. "Here," he said. Prissy had a look. "Coo, it's obvious where I am," she said. "Candy and Caprice are going to be like green with envy." Aunt Vera and Mr. Wing had their heads bent over a piece of paper on which they were negotiating the price of the house. There were so many zeros, it made Henry's mind boggle. "Coo, I'm going to the ladies' room," said Prissy, getting to her feet. "I bet there'll be loads of freebies." Henry panicked. She would spot Dr. Tang on the way. He jumped up too. "Me too, I'm coming." "Come on then," said Prissy irritably. Prissy turned right, but Henry leapt into her path and barged into her, pushing her in the other direction. "Henry, stop it," she said, brushing him off. "But I want to go by the kaleidoscope," he said. "Well, I don't," said Prissy. "Oh, for goodness sake, take him by the kaleidoscope, Prissy, and stop causing such a scene," said Aunt Vera. Glancing over the top of her reading glasses, Prissy huffed and stomped off with Henry beside her. Henry knew she was furious with him for cramping her style as she sashayed out of the room. But he stuck to her like glue. "So," she said when they reached a rainbow in the coloured wall, "does baby Henry want to go?" "A quick one," he said, opening the door set into the wall. "But you have to come too." "No way. I'll see you back at the table," she said. Stars is getting quite tricky now. Hang on. Back, lovely. Back. Good boy. Good boy. "I'll tell Mum about you and Candy going to bongos." "How do you know I've been there?" said Prissy, spinning round. "Nat and I watched you through the window. We saw you and Candy with your needles." "Mum will never believe you." Henry held out his squirrel. "Nut, play bongo Prissy visit." Up came a shot of Prissy and Candy entering the doors of a rainbow-coloured shop. Once inside, the girls were greeted by a dark-haired man dressed in a long, stripy knitted coat and hat. He hugged them before leading them over to a table laden with balls of wool in every colour of the rainbow. The girls sat down and the man passed them each a piece of knitting from a basket. They started to click their needles together, chatting and giggling. "You know what Mummy thinks of..." "Oh, no, sorry." Phew. Star's gone back to his field for a rest. He hugged them before leading them over to a table laden with balls of wool in every colour of the rainbow. The girls sat down and the man passed them each a piece of knitting from a basket. They started to click their needles together, chatting and giggling. "You know what Mummy thinks of knitters," said Henry. "She hates them more than she does hippies." "You wouldn't dare," said Prissy. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Dr. Tang throw her head back and laugh. He narrowed his eyes. "Try me." Prissy pushed him through the door. This had better be quick. They entered a small round room. The floor, walls and ceiling were mirrored. A circular window looked out over the city. "Go on then," huffed Prissy. Henry stepped forward and pressed the big screen button below the window. Another piece of glass slid out of the wall over the window. In between two sheets of thick glass lay pockets of multicoloured glass beads. As it began to rotate, the beads started to shift, creating psychedelic patterns. "This is definitely the best one," said Henry. Prissy stood with her arms folded across her chest, staring at the patterns. One go and we're done, right? Henry nodded, hoping that Dr. Tang would be gone by now. 5 minutes later, they were on their way back, but Dr. Tang was still with her friends. Henry waited for Prissy to go to the ladies before whipping out Nut to call Wen. "Hiya!" said Wen, hearing the news. The toilet door opened and Prissy reappeared, her lips coated in a thick layer of pink lip gloss. Henry cut the call, hiding Nut behind his back. "You didn't have to wait," said Prissy, glaring at him. "I didn't want to get lost," said Henry. "You are so lame," she hissed, grabbing him by the arm. Back at the table, Henry was relieved to find his mother and Mr. Wing still in conversation. Noting that Dr. Tang was still in her seat, he slumped in his armchair in front of an enormous glass of popco juice. Prissy started studying the floor plan of their new home on her mother's fast pad, so he ducked under the table with his squirrel. "I'm back at my seat, Wen," he whispered. "I've come up with a plan. Watch." Henry sat back up and looked over his mother's bent head. Dr. Tang was still sipping tea. Suddenly she stopped, reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. Henry watched her smile change to a deep frown. She stood up from the table, picked up her bag and jacket and headed towards the exit across the room. Henry gulped. His mother and Mr. Wang were still busy, heads locked, and Prissy had her nose stuck in the fast pad. He held his breath. Dr. Tang was now walking directly towards their table before coming to a stop right next to them. She checked her phone again. Henry thought he might faint. He ducked back under the table. He saw her shiny pumps start heading across the carpet towards the lobby and let out his breath so loudly that Aunt Vera looked up. "Are you all right, Henry?" she asked, seeing his bright red face. Henry nodded. "My gosh, wasn't that Dr. Tang?" said Mr. Wing in a gossipy tone. Aunt Vera smiled smugly. "Oh no, Dr. Tang's at her beach house in Tai Long Wan," she said. "I should know because my niece is staying with them." Back to Nat in Mongolia. Chapter 47, Saddle Sore. Altan undid the ropes and Nat swung a wobbly leg over the saddle and landed with a thud in the snow. Her horse put its head down and nosed her, its hot breath defrosting her face. She lay there staring up at its nostrils, wondering if she'd ever be able to walk again. They'd been riding for hours. The saddle was the hardest thing she'd ever sat on. It had rubbed her legs raw and her bottom was numb. Altan offered her a hand up. "Leave me alone," she growled, feeling that somehow he was to blame. He shrugged and led his horse off towards the corral. Fred came striding across the snow, carrying her 2 crates. She stopped where Nat lay, put the crates down, grasped Nat's hand and hauled her up to her feet. "No time to rest. I need you to help me carry these," she said. 2 hours later, Nat lay exhausted on a roll-out mattress next to a stove in a new ger. She wasn't alone. Fred, Altan and a family of 5, a mother, father, 2 girls and a boy, were all fanned out across the tent floor, buried under thick wool blankets. Nat hadn't been this tired in a very long time, not since she, Jamuka and Ah Wong had sailed up the coast of China last summer. Then she'd been exhausted from her role as deckhand, hauling ropes and sails, since the Junko's rigging computer had broken 2 days into the trip. Closing her eyes, she became acutely aware of the crackle of the wood burning in the stove and the low hum of breathing. It was a far cry from the bedtime sound she had grown up with, the whistling wind, Gobi's sweet birdsong, and the ocean lapping at the hull of the junco. She missed the swaying motion that had lulled her to sleep every night. She missed her home, and she missed Jamuka. Reaching under her blanket, she pulled out Fizz, who remained swaddled in his robot warmer suit. She tapped him once on the snout, activating his silent mode, and his eyes snapped open. They had a warm emerald glow to them, something he'd not seen since they'd stepped out into the Arctic air at the airport in Ulaanbaatar. Pulling the blanket up over her head so that she didn't disturb Fred, who lay snoring away next to her, she unzipped and removed his suit. Her heart leapt as she watched his wings slowly unfurl. In the darkness of the underblanket world, his wings shimmered, each scale throwing off a tiny pinprick of diamond-like light. She'd forgotten just how beautiful he was. His screen flickered, lighting up, not to its normal luminescent brightness, but to a dim, powered-down version. "Play Gobi's song movie. Keep silent mode," she whispered into his ear. Instantly, she was transported on board the junco. Its deck appeared on screen, and Hong Kong's skyline towered up in the background. Wen and Jamuka were seated on cushions, with Gobi's cage on the decking between them. Wen's hair was bright yellow, with tangerine stripes, the same colour as her dress. Jamuka was dressed in a black suit, wearing his signature round mirrored sunglasses, and both were studying Smartsheets, which they held in their hands. Nat didn't need sound. She'd watched it at least 100 times before. They were rehearsing their words for "Gobi, Gobi, my name's not Moby," which she and Wen had written for their school performance last year. Neither of them could compose music, so they'd opted to do a kind of rap version instead. A smile twitched at her lips as she watched Jamuka and Wen start rapping to Gobi. Gobi started to flap his wings and join in. The song played along in Nat's head, as did the gales of laughter at the end. All she wanted to do was be back there now. It felt like she'd just dozed off when she was woken by a deafening clatter of metal pots. She opened her eyes to find that everyone else was already up and gone. Mattresses had been rolled away, leaving a lone woman with a couple of cooking pots on the stove. A mutton fug hung in the air. Nat pushed herself up. She unfolded her coat, which she'd used as her pillow, and slipped it on. Her legs were stiff as boards. She clambered to her feet like an old woman, wincing at the thought of sitting in the saddle again. Every bone and muscle in her body ached. The woman looked up from her stirring as Nat hobbled over to the door and pulled on her boots. Nat managed a faint smile and bowed her head before stepping out through the door. A refreshing smell of wood smoke and horses greeted her. She pulled her hat down low over her face and ears to try and block out the icy cold. She flapped her arms about like a bird as she endeavoured to warm up. It was another crystal clear blue sky. The sun was creeping up over a forest of pine trees. Out here somewhere was Jamuka and his clan, and the two-men Vachir. A feeling of dread washed over her. What if she was too late? What if she dare not think it, but it popped up anyway? What if they were already dead? Voices were coming from the direction of the forest. She blinked away a mist of involuntary tears and crunched her way over the snow towards the tree line. A few steps in, she came to a makeshift gate in a wall of pine branches. She opened it to find a small corral where Altan and another man were saddling up the horses. "Oglunimend," said Altan. Nat nodded, unsure of what he meant. "Watch, learn, princess," he said. He showed Nat how to position the saddle and let her tighten the girth. Next came the bridle. As Nat put it over the horse's ears, she let out a deep sigh. "How long do we ride?" she said. "Day," said Altan. "A whole day to get to the clan?" "Yes, princess." She let out a groan. It was thickly layered with growing despair. "Too long," she said. Altan shrugged and looked up at the sky. "Long ride to clan, princess." "Stop calling me princess! You! In her frustration, she found herself lost for words. "You utterly annoying altapotamus!" "Alta?" said Altan, raising his eyebrows. A roar of laughter erupted behind him, making them both jump. "By Jove, that's genius, young lady," said Fred, lumbering across the snow. "We have discovered a new species, the altapotamus." Altan narrowed his eyes. "You fun make?" Fred slapped him hard on the back. "No, we species make. Now then, I'm fueled on salty tea, so let's get going, shall we?" Chapter 48, Mahuang. They were moving steadily through the trees when the snow flurries started. Altan was in the lead. He hadn't spoken to them since the altapotamus incident. Nat wondered how he knew where they were going. Everywhere looked the same. The sky had clouded over with a grey blanket. The wind had picked up, and icy flakes now began to fall, pricking her face like tiny needles. Despite the horse's body heat, Nat was chilled to the bone. The air seemed too thin the higher they went, and she began to feel a familiar tightening in her chest. She slowed her horse and took Fizz out of her pocket. "Fizz, air," she commanded, putting his snout to her mouth. A tiny whiff of asthma medication seeped out into her mouth. "Too cold, malfunction," said Fizz, his voice now dull and flat. Fear gripped her like a vice. "Help!" she wheezed, reining her horse to a stop. Fred trotted up behind. "No time for potty stops." She stopped and took one look at Nat's deathly pale face as Nat whispered, "Can't breathe," before falling off her horse. "Altan!" shouted Fred, jumping down to the ground. "Joint fur, quick!" Altan continued on his horse. He didn't turn round. "Joint!" he shouted. Fred pulled out her notebook from inside her hat. She took off her gloves and quickly thumbed through it. "Ma-wung!" she yelled, striding off into the forest. This time Altan turned his head. The moment he saw Nat on the ground, he reined his horse about and came galloping back. He drew up sharply, his horse's hooves spraying up snow in Nat's face. "Mahuang," he said, jumping down. He put his hand under her armpit, hauling her up into a sitting position. Her nose whistled and her airways wheezed as she tried to suck in tiny wisps of air. He grabbed dry wood from his saddlebags and quickly made a fire. He took a small pot, filled it with fresh snow and placed it over the flames. Nat heard the crackle of burning wood. A fire wouldn't help. She didn't want to die here, like this. Altan spread out a goat skin next to the fire and pulled Nat onto it. Kneeling next to her, he took off his fur-lined coat and put it around her shoulders. "Look," he said, taking her hands in his. Nat forced herself to look up. Dark spots swam in front of her eyes. Altan inhaled deeply through his nose like a snuffling pig, and then out through his mouth. He repeated it. "You same," he said. Nat shook her head. She was dizzy now. Her airways were closing up quickly. "Yes, Princess," he said, fixing his eyes onto hers. She wheezed in once and out once. "More!" he shouted. Nat tried again. "More!" he roared. His brown eyes locked onto hers. He didn't blink. His face bore deep furrows of concentration. She felt like she was being hypnotized. "Ma Huang!" said Fred, triumphantly marching up to the fire, waving a long, spindly branch. "Otherwise known as joint fir, the oldest remedy in the world for asthma. Now we need to make it swiftly into tea." She thrust it into the boiling water and waited until the liquid turned a murky brown. "Drink this," said Fred, holding a bowl to Nat's lips. "Small sips, please, but you must drink it hot as possible." Trying to drink at the same time as breathe was pure torture. The tea burned her lips, her tongue, but Fred held it steady, barking at her to keep drinking. The minutes ticked by. Nat drank 3 bowlfuls. She was drowning in tea, but the wheezing was slowing. She managed a weak smile. "Thank you," she said, looking from Fred to Altan. "I'm sorry I called you an altopotamus earlier." His eyes darted from hers to the ground between them. Instead of a princess quip, he silently bowed his head. "Now then, young man, all this activity has made me ravenous. Let's have some of the mutton fat tea before we head off," said Fred. Altan stood up and walked over to his horse. Nat looked out across the forest floor. That had been a close call. Without Fred and Altan, she'd probably be dead by now. She reached inside her pocket. It was empty. Where was Fizz? Her mind flashed back to him in her hand as he'd tried to blast her the medication. She must have dropped him to the ground. She pushed herself up to her feet and took a few shaky steps to where her horse was tethered. And then a mournful, long howl came echoing through the trees, making the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The horses whinnied, shifting uneasily in the snow. "What the blazes is?" said Fred. Altan threw back his head and let out a long, deep howl. "Extraordinary," said Fred, reaching for her notebook. "It must be a communication tool." Nat spotted Fizz lying up ahead in the snow, his green snout peeking up out of the yellow robot warmer suit. But fear rooted her to the spot. Wolves. Real, live wolves, just like the ones Jamuka had described in his bedtime stories. This time, not one, but 2 distinctively different howls came sounding through the trees. Adrenaline started to pulse through her veins, making her hyper-alert. Altan howled back again. "They come," he said, kicking snow onto the fire, extinguishing the flames. "Wolves," said Nat, her heart beating fast. "We ride," he said. She stumbled across the snow and picked up Fizz. Despite the suit, his eyes were now locked closed in power-down mode. Altan grabbed her hand and hurried her to his horse. "I can't ride yours," she said, as he hoisted her up into the saddle. Looking down, the ground seemed a long way away. "I can," he said, jumping up behind her. Before Nat could protest, he kicked his horse on. She shot back against his chest. "Hold on," he said, reaching around and taking the reins. She hooked her hands onto the pommel, gripping tight, as Altan rode over to her own horse and grabbed its tether. "Chew," he urged. Both horses broke into a gallop. She closed her eyes against the wind and snow, while Altan expertly rode through the trees at a lightning pace. The pine trees started to thicken. He slowed them to a trot, before finally coming to a halt in a small clearing. "Woo!" bellowed Fred, thundering up beside them. Her feet shot out of the stirrups. She threw one leg over the saddle and came crashing down to land in the snow. She lifted the top crate off the back of the saddle and started rummaging inside. "My samples are being compromised with all this frantic movement," she grumbled, holding up a test tube with a brown froth inside. "My Dolichus musanti shouldn't look like this." said Altan, his finger to his lips. Fred shot him a look of thunder and turned back to her crate. Altan signalled for Nat to dismount. The moment she landed, he waved her away from the horse. She took a few steps back, unsure where she should go. Too far away and she might get eaten by a wolf. She turned to ask him, but now he was holding his horse's head in his hands, looking straight into its eyes, just as he had done with her during the asthma attack. The horse pulled back for a moment, uncomfortable at the intrusion, but suddenly a quiver ran through its body and its gaze fell comfortably on Altan's face. "What are you doing?" she whispered. "Ready for Wolf," he said, moving on to Fred's horse. "When Wolf come, stay." Just as he said this, an enormous shadow came bounding through the trees. A jet-black wolf hurled itself at Altan, knocking him flat. Nat screamed as the two of them fell to the ground, resting in a knot of arms and legs. Fred's horse reared up and galloped off into the forest. Suddenly the wolf stopped, its golden eyes coming to rest on Nat's face. She turned to flee. "Stay," said Altan. Looking back, she saw the wolf looking at her. It was as if he could see right into her very being. All breath left her. Her heart was banging like a drum inside her chest. This wolf was tall, nearly shoulder height. He lifted a large paw and started to lope towards her. Altan made a deep guttural sound from the base of his throat. The wolf stopped in its tracks. Now it was only meters away from her, its gaze unflinching, and she was rooted to the spot, more terrified than she had ever been in her whole life. Altan made the sound again. This time the wolf turned and loped back to where he was standing. "Incredible!" sang Fred, making notes in her book from a good distance away. "His name is Jebe," said Altan. The wolf lay down at his side, tipped its head back and howled. "Jebe, say you clan, princess," said Altan, folding his arms across his chest. "That is because she is," said a very familiar voice as a horse came galloping through the trees. The end of chapter 48. Thank you very much for joining me and Star earlier today. I hope you've enjoyed this, and please keep safe, and I will hopefully see you again soon. Bye-bye.